Stir, my heart, bewail this land from which you have sprung. When there is silence before evil, and when what should be chided is feared, then the great man is overthrown in the land of your birth. Tire not while this is before you. Rise against what is before you. Lo, the great no longer rule the land. What was made has been unmade. The Prophecy of Nefertiti. The second intermediate period in ancient Egypt witnessed rule by an invading force from the east and a growing threat from the south. Multiple dynasties of kings ruled simultaneously in several sites in Egypt until the emergence of the increasingly formidable 17th dynasty. Pressure from the north and south mounted and led to the great battles to decide the fate of Egypt. Elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia, great and prosperous kingdoms lay unaware of lurking threats that would destroy them forever. There have been many periods in ancient history where there were huge successive shifts of power across a large geographical space within a short span of time. These power shifts could be caused by war, famine, migration, and other factors which would affect this city, followed by that city, and so on, until finally these lands would stabilize. Some of these periods lasted a couple of decades, others more than 100 years or so. I refer to this space of time as a chaos corridor. What led to foreign rule in Egypt and the diminishment of their empire? How did great kings and their civilizations suddenly collapse? How did power shifts change the map of the ancient world? In this episode, I will answer all of these questions and more. I'm your host, Brianna Jackson. Join me in exploring ancient lives on the Nile. When Anu the Sublime, king of the Anunnaki, and Bel, the lord of heaven and earth, who decreed the fate of the land, assigned to Marduk, the overruling son of Ea, god of righteousness, dominion over earthly man, and made him great among the Igigi, they called Babylon by his illustrious name, made it great on earth, and founded an everlasting kingdom in it, whose foundations are laid so solidly as those of heaven and earth. The Code of Hammurabi. This episode of Ancient Lives on the Nile examines the rise, prosperity, and collapse of several kingdoms, including the Babylonians and Kassites of Mesopotamia, the Hittites of western Anatolia, the Minoans of the Aegean, the Hyksos of Egypt's delta, the Kerma kingdom of Nubia, and of course, the ancient Egyptians. During Egypt's late Middle Kingdom, two kingdoms in Mesopotamia and Anatolia were thriving: Old Babylon and the Old Hittite Kingdom, which were led by powerful new dynasties of kings. In Anatolia and in southern Mesopotamia, consolidated kingdoms did not yet exist in 1750 BCE. These regions were made up of mostly city-states and small kingdoms, rather than large kingdoms ruled from a central capital. The Great Hammurabi, for example, was the first to build a Babylonian state, which is the area where ancient Mesopotamia began. King Hammurabi of Babylon, best known for his code of laws inscribed on a tall basalt stela, came to power when Babylon was a collection of city-states. The most powerful kingdom before his time was the already ancient Assyria, centered at a site called Mari, but also colonies were established in southern and central Turkey. By the time Hammurabi came to his throne in the 1790s, the king of Assyria, based at both Ashur and Mari, was Shamshi-Adad. He was a mighty and militarily active king who maintained the Assyrian borders with ease. Though he accepted Hammurabi as an ally, he also viewed Hammurabi as inferior. Shamshi-Adad died sometime in Hammurabi's 17th year, and after some succession troubles, Zimri-Lim became the king of Mari. By this time, Hammurabi had grown considerably in his confidence as king, and saw in the succession of Zimri-Lim an opportunity to stretch the powerful hand of Babylon. Rulers from Eshnunna and Elam also noticed the opportunity, and so the bid for power in southern Mesopotamia was opened. The ruler of Elam seized the opportunity by entering an alliance with Zimri-Lim in Mari, whereas the ruler of Eshnunna invested in military campaigns. Together, the kings of Mari and Elam defeated Eshnunna, which in turn boosted the confidence of the Elam king, and, like Shamshi-Adad, viewed his fellow kings as inferior. Moreover, he attempted to cut Hammurabi and Zimri-Lim off from one another in order to increase his power over them. Tell your master that his messengers should no longer go to Babylon, and that Babylonians should no longer go to your master. Letter from the king of Elam to the ambassador of Mari. The king of Elam, as people in power so often do, grew overconfident. He tried to play Pied Piper with all of the kings around him and got lost in his own game. He demanded that Hammurabi send him soldiers so that the king of Elam could use them to attack another great southern Mesopotamian city, Larsa. But at the same time, he sent a letter to Larsa, asking Larsa to send him soldiers so that he could attack Babylon. But the two kings knew about it because they exchanged letters, which somehow the king of Elam never expected. Then he tried to turn around and do the same thing to Zimri-Lim, the king of Mari, who was at that time his closest ally, revealing that he had his eyes set on controlling northern Mesopotamia. Obviously, this didn't work out so well for the king of Elam. Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi united against him and then defeated Elam. Now with Elam defeated and pushed back to the Zagros Mountains, Hammurabi was free to pursue expanding his own kingdom and set his sights on Larsa. In his war against Larsa, Hammurabi, with help from Mari, first took the cities Ishin and Nippur, leaving Larsa considerably weakened. It fell to Hammurabi after 6 months of siege, and by 1762, Hammurabi held control of the whole of southern Mesopotamia. Then, over time, Hammurabi and Zimri-Lim of Mari began to squabble over resources, which deteriorated their alliance. Eventually, Hammurabi marched north to defeat Zimri-Lim, and at last, in 1760, the 700-year-old city fell. Babylon was now a superpower, and as such, it would later draw the attention of the Hittite kings in Anatolia. The king of Kusara, Pitkhana, my father, came down out of the city in force, and he took the city of Nesha in the night by force. He took the king of Nesha captive, but he did not do any evil to the inhabitants of Nesha. Instead, he made them mothers and fathers, and in the night, I, Anita, took Hattusha by force, and in its place I sowed weeds. Whoever becomes king after me and settles Hattusha again, may the storm god of heaven smite him. The Proclamation of Anita. The seedlings of the Hittite kingdom were planted around 1750 by the king Pitkhana of Kusara, an as yet undiscovered city, when he conquered both Hattusha and Kanesh, now known as Kultepe. Kanesh had been a trading outpost settled by the Assyrians, and shortly after its conquest by Pitkhana, it seems that Assyrian trade in Anatolia diminished. Anita succeeded his father and held both Kanesh and Kusara. What happened to the Kusara kingdom after this remains a mystery, and only the Proclamation of Anita, which survives in 3 copies dating to long after his reign, preserves the tale of the first attempt at building a Hittite kingdom, as well as the curse stating that future kings of the city Hattusha will be destroyed. Then in around 1650 BCE, Hattushili came to power, possibly in Kusara, and conquered eastern Anatolia and founded both the first true Hittite kingdom and the first Hittite dynasty of kings. He centered his kingdom at the city Hattusha, which would remain the Hittite capital for almost 600 years. The empire he built extended as far south as Syria at the site Al-Alaq, though the desirable nearby city Aleppo remained outside his grasp. During the events in Mesopotamia and Anatolia, the Minoan civilization of Crete and its surrounding islands was enjoying its own prosperity. What is known about the Minoans comes largely from the archaeological remains and vibrant wall paintings, because the Minoan script remains undeciphered to this day. Probably the textual evidence that survives is bureaucratic in nature and does not contain the richness of personal communications, royal propaganda, or literary tales like the texts found in Western Asia and Egypt. The archaeology reveals Crete contained many palace-centered states. It is unclear whether the entire island was controlled under one king who perhaps ruled from the large palace city Knossos. They were seafaring, as would be expected of an island society, and archaeological evidence indicates that they also had a settlement in northern Egypt. Egypt itself was slowly edging toward the Second Intermediate Period. Kings of the 13th dynasty were ruling a strong country that extended far into Nubia. Its southern boundary stretched to a site called Semna, which had been taken by 12th dynasty king Senwosret III. Thus, Egypt had complete control over Nubia. To stop when attacked is to make bold the foe's heart. Attack is valor, retreat is cowardice. A coward is he who is driven from his border. Since the Nubian listens to the word of mouth, to answer him is to make him retreat. Attack him, he will turn his back. Retreat, he will start attacking. They are not people one respects. They are wretches, craven-hearted. The boundary stela of Senwosret III. Though slowly diminishing in power, the 13th dynasty kings enjoyed the budding empire their predecessors built. Compared to other periods in Egyptian history, the 13th dynasty is still largely unknown. However, it is clear that they maintained a great deal of power in the first half of the dynasty, but started to diminish toward the second half, which marks the first steps into the chaos corridor. I shall describe what is before me. I do not foretell what does not come. Dry is the river of Egypt. One crosses the river on foot. One seeks water for the ships to sail on, its course having turned into shoreland. Shoreland will turn into water, water course back into shoreland. South wind will combat north wind. Sky will lack the single wind. The Prophecy of Neferti. The 13th dynasty began with stability, but midway through, the first signs of the impending Second Intermediate Period emerged. It seems that it was toward the end of this dynasty that the unity of Egypt began to disintegrate, and multiple dynasties began to rule concomitantly. Still, Egyptologists argue over the chronology, but often suggest that the later 13th dynasty was ruling at the same time as the early 14th and 16th dynasties. The three of them were ruling in either the north or south of Egypt. Only in the 13th dynasty did the kings rule a united, though periodically unstable, land. However, it appears that the later 13th dynasty kings were interred at Abydos rather than in Saqqara, possibly pointing to their base of operations shifting to Thebes rather than the 12th dynasty capital Itich-Tawi. Recently, a discovery at Abydos has complicated the chronology further, with archaeological evidence pointing to yet another dynasty of kings ruling simultaneously with the others and who were interred at Abydos. This dynasty is referred to as the Abydos dynasty. Essentially, what was happening in Egypt was the opposite of what was happening in Babylon under the reign of King Hammurabi. Hammurabi had united all of the kingdoms and city-states of Mesopotamia for the first time, whereas Egypt disintegrated into numerous kingdoms. Of course, we call them dynasties, but in essence, they were small kingdoms with varying degrees of power. Already in the reign of 13th dynasty king Sobek-Hotep IV, trouble began to brew in Nubia. A stela fragment dating to his reign describes a military expedition against the northern Nubians in the region called Wawat. A later rock-cut tomb in El Kab, contemporary with the 16th dynasty sometime between 1700 and 1650 BCE, and belonging to a governor named Sobek-Nakht II, contains an inscription describing further military exploits against the Nubians. Cush came aroused along his length, he having stirred up the chiefdoms of Wawat, the islands of Kent-hen-Nefer, Punt, and the Medjau. The autobiography of Sobek-Nakht. What is most interesting about this inscription is that it reveals the several Nubian chiefdoms were uniting for the first time under one major alliance that struck against Egypt to reclaim the land conquered by Senwosret III about 200 years before. Even more striking is the inclusion of Punt in this alliance. Punt was a major trading partner with Egypt during the New Kingdom, and no other text indicates any animosity or warfare between the two regions. The text in Sobek-Nakht's tomb is the only occurrence of Punt warring against Egypt. Sobek-Nakht managed to hold off the Nubian coalition, but it was a sign of the rise of the Kingdom of Kush. The Kingdom of Kush was centered at a site called Kerma at the third cataract of the Nile River in Upper Nubia. Already in the Middle Kingdom, Kerma was a bustling city, but by 1650 BCE, if not earlier, Kerma had fully grown into the capital of a large kingdom. Though Egypt, through Sobek-Nakht, had come out victorious against the united Nubian chiefdoms once before, Egypt could not stop the strength of Kush. While power in Egypt was dwindling in the face of countrywide dissolution into multiple dynasties, it seems Egyptians withdrew from Nubian colonies, leaving them open to the Nubians. Indeed, they swept into Lower Nubia, Wawat, and reclaimed the land that was theirs. Thus, the Kerma kingdom expanded, placing its boundary at Egypt's doorstep at Elephantine, and would become a formidable enemy of the Egyptian kings of the 17th dynasty in Egypt's long war against the Hyksos. A strange bird will breed in the Delta Marsh, having made its nest beside the people having let it approach by default. Then perish those delightful things, the fish ponds full of fish-eaters, teeming with fish and fowl. All happiness has vanished. The land is bowed down in distress, owing to those feeders, A'amu, who roam the land. Foes have risen in the east, A'amu have come down to Egypt. Desert flocks will drink at the river of Egypt, take their ease on the shores for lack of one to fear. For this land is to and fro, knowing not what comes. The Prophecy of Neferti. The Hyksos dominion over the delta in northern Egypt was not a result of invasion. Rather, it seems they arrived from the east, perhaps from the Levant, as migrants, known in ancient Egyptian as A'amu. They settled in the delta area, and over time their settlements grew. The earliest pictorial record of the Hyksos comes from a Middle Kingdom tomb in Middle Egypt belonging to Khnum-Hotep II, in which a trading or migrant group is entering Egypt, carrying their personal belongings, children, and weapons. Their leader is identified as Ibsha, the Heka Chasut, or ruler of foreign lands, and it is from this term that the word Hyksos is derived. They settled mostly in the delta town called Avaris, which would become the capital when the Hyksos ruled northern Egypt, making up the 15th dynasty. When the Hyksos gained enough power to take control of northern Egypt is not exactly known, but doubtless it coincides with the conclusion of the 13th dynasty, when the Middle Kingdom capital Itich-Tawi began to diminish in power. Avaris was also settled by the Minoans of Crete. A palace was discovered there, decorated with Minoan frescoes, namely featuring the bull-leaping motif. But this palace may post-date the Hyksos occupation. The art of the Minoans, particularly their painted vessels, was prized throughout the eastern Mediterranean. By the time the Hyksos were firmly ruling northern Egypt, the Hittites were seeking to expand their territories. Toward the end of Hattusili I's reign, his original successor, his nephew, plotted against him, probably to speed things along to acquire the throne. Hattusili had become aware of his plot and then banished his nephew. Then he adopted his grandson Murshili as his son and successor, who became king in around 1620 BCE. "Behold, Murshili is now my son. Him you must recognize. Him you must set upon the throne. And in the hour when a call to arms goes forth, or perchance a serious rebellion occurs, you, my servants and chieftains, must be at hand to help my son." The Last Testament of Hattusili I. Hattusili's Last Testament was apparently inscribed on a tablet that was meant to be read monthly to Murshili, to remind him of his loyalty to Hattusili, as well as to recount to him the dangers he might face as a king. But also, it was meant to be a warning to officials about what terrible things would happen to them if they didn't support Murshili. And we see a similar thing in Egyptian literature from the Middle Kingdom. There is a story where the first king of the 12th dynasty, who had been possibly assassinated, appears to his son to warn him of the perils of kingship. "The bloodshed occurred while I was without you, before the courtiers had heard what I would hand over to you, before I had sat with you so as to advise you, for I had not prepared for it, had not expected it, had not foreseen the failing of the servants." The instructions of King Amenemhat to his son King Senwosret. The Hurrians of Syria, probably the fledgling Mitannian kingdom that would become a major ally in Egypt's 18th dynasty, had revolted against Hattusili, who then lost most of his conquered cities. But when Murshili came to the throne, he reclaimed those cities and even managed to take the powerful and ancient Aleppo, the great city that Hattusili was never able to defeat. Thus Murshili re-established the boundaries of what could potentially have become the first Hittite empire, had he not reached too far to Babylon. Then the gods made the sky come in a storm of rain, with darkness in the western region and the sky be clouded without stop, louder than the sound of the subjects, stronger than the howling on the hills, more than the sound of the cavern in Elephantine. Then every house and every habitation they reached perished, and those in them died, their corpses floating on the water like skiffs of papyrus. Even in the doorway and the private apartments of the palace, for a period of up to several days, while no torch could give light over the two lands. The Tempest Stela of Ahmose. Murshili II had come to the throne after tumultuous events relating to succession, but his reign proved to be a successful one. He set off on military campaigns as his grandfather had done, and claimed the city Aleppo as his prize. And then he set his eyes on Babylon, where the dynasty of the great Hammurabi still held sway over all of Mesopotamia. Though it was a bold campaign, Murshili managed to do the unimaginable and sack the city. In 1595 BCE, Babylon fell and was destroyed. And then Murshili I marched to Aleppo, and he destroyed Aleppo and brought captives and possessions of Aleppo to Hattusha. Then, however, he marched to Babylon, and he destroyed Babylon, and he defeated the Hurrian troops, and he brought captives and possessions of Babylon to Hattusha. The Proclamation of Telepinu. However, Murshili did not set up a Hittite colony there. Instead, he left it to the rule of a new dynasty of Babylonians, the Kassites, and marched back to Hattusha with his spoils, among which was a statue of the Babylonian chief god Marduk. The capture of Babylon was the crowning jewel of Murshili's achievements as king, but unfortunately this success was short-lived. Only a few years following the sack of Babylon, Hattusili's warnings of disloyal officials came true. Mursili II was assassinated by his brother-in-law, who seemed to have done it because capturing Babylon angered the gods.
There's an interesting parallel between the account of Mursili's capture of Babylon and his subsequent murder, and how it fits into the literature of that time. First, Hammurabi wrote that Babylon would never fall. Second, Anita, the second king of the old Hittite kingdom, stated in his proclamation, which was admittedly written after his reign, that any king who would rule Hattusha after him would be killed by the storm god. When Mursili sacked Babylon, he stole the statue of Marduk. Marduk was the king of the gods, but could also be associated with storms, so essentially he could be a storm god. Though it's an embellishment to the history, you could say that Anita's curse on the kings of Hattusha came true.
I am Marduk, great lord, the most lofty one, he who inspects, who goes back and forth through the mountains, the lofty one, inspector who smites lands, he who goes constantly back and forth in the lands from sunrise to sunset am I. I gave the command that I go to Hatti. I put Hatti to the test. There I set up the throne of my supreme godhead. For 24 years I dwelt there. A king of Babylon arose and led me in procession to Babylon. Fair was the processional way of Babylon. The Marduk Prophecy. Following the assassination of Mursili, the Hittite kingdom fell into decline, facing the same fate they had inflicted on the Babylonians. The statue of Marduk remained in Hattusha for 24 years until Babylon rose again, ruled by the Kassite dynasty for over 400 years. While the Hittite kingdom was declining, the Theban kings of the 17th dynasty were growing in power. Though, like other dynasties of the Second Intermediate Period, the 17th dynasty still is not entirely known. However, the last 4 kings of this dynasty and their mighty queens are the most well-known because it was they who rose up against the Hyksos ruling in the Delta. They each reigned during the reign of the Hyksos king Apep, who was a formidable foe for King Seqenenre-Tao. It came to pass that the land of Egypt was in misery, as there was no lord functioning as a proper king of the time. It happened that King Seqenenre was but ruler of Thebes, and misery was in the city of the Hyksos, while Apep was in avarice. Now as for Apep, it was his wish to send an inflammatory message to Seqenenre, king of Thebes. I shall send a message to Seqenenre that we may assess the power of the god who is with him as protector. When the messenger of Apep reached Seqenenre, he was taken into his presence. Then Seqenenre said to the messenger of Apep, "Why have you been sent to Thebes? Why have you come journeying here?" The messenger then answered him, "It is King Apep who has sent me to you in order to say, let there be a withdrawal from the lagoon of hippopotamuses which is in the east sector of Thebes, because they don't let sleep come to me, either in the daytime or at night, for the noise of them is in his ears." Then Seqenenre became stupefied for a long while, remaining unable to render a reply to the messenger of Apep. The Quarrel of Apep and Seqenenre.
In the story of Apep and Seqenenre, the Hyksos king wants to get under the skin of the Theban king. He sends this ridiculous request to Seqenenre for him to do something about his noisy hippos. Now, the story was written in the 19th dynasty, and so far there aren't any records of a 17th dynasty version, so we don't know if it was based on a true story. But what we have is a funny story. Seqenenre is completely confused by the request. He doesn't see the ruse right away, so he's willing to go along with it. We don't know the rest of the story because sadly it doesn't survive, which is probably one of the greatest tragedies regarding ancient Egyptian literature. We want to know what happened to those hippos.
The Quarrel of Apep and Seqenenre also commemorates actual war between the Theban kings and the Hyksos, which is evidenced in the archaeology by the war paraphernalia that belonged to Seqenenre-Tao's wife, Ahotep. Her burial goods included ceremonial axes, daggers, and a fly necklace that was usually given by the king to his soldiers for exceptional bravery and service in battle. But also, the mummified remains of second Enrei Tao himself were discovered, though in a poor state of preservation. His skull reveals that he died a violent and gruesome death because it is lacerated with axe wounds in multiple locations. Archaeologists discovered that these wounds fit together with Levantine or Hyksos axe heads, revealing that it was by this weapon that he died. It had been suggested that he died in a battle against the Hyksos, but more recently, it was suggested that second Enrei Tao was executed. This illustrates that second Enrei may have been captured in battle and executed by the Hyksos, perhaps even by their king, Apep himself. Second Enrei was succeeded by Kamose, assumed to be his son, who made considerably more progress in the fight to expel the Hyksos and reunite Egypt during his 3 or 5 year reign. Information about his battles against the Hyksos is preserved on 2 stelae that not only give a full account of his march on Avaris, but also details his discovery of a plot against him by both the Hyksos and Nubians, who created an alliance. Their plan was to defeat the Theban kings together and distribute Egypt into 2 parts, with the northern half ruled by the Hyksos and the southern half ruled by the Nubians. For it was on the upland way of the oasis that I captured his messenger going south to Cush with a written letter. I found on it saying in writing, "From the ruler of Avaris, Apep, greetings to the son of the ruler of Cush. Why have you arisen as ruler without letting me know? Do you see what Egypt has done against me? The ruler who is in it, Kamose, attacks me on my soil, although I have not attacked him in the manner of all he has done against you, for he chooses the 2 lands to afflict him, my land and yours, and he has devastated them. Come northward, do not blench, for he is here with me, and there is no one who can stand up to you in this part of Egypt. See, I will not give him away until you arrive. Then we shall divide the towns of Egypt, and both our fine lands shall be in joy." The Stela of Kamose. Kamose then sailed north for the purpose of besieging Avaris, and his assault on the land surrounding the city was somewhat successful. However, Apep did not rise to meet him in battle, and Kamose did not lay siege to the city after all. Very early into his reign, Kamose died, most likely in battle. His death then led to the succession of Ahmose, the hero of Egypt, who would become a god. Then a king will come from the south, child of Upper Egypt. He will take the white crown, he will wear the red crown. He will join the 2 mighty ones. He will please the 2 lords with what they wish, with field circler in his fist or in his grasp. Rejoice, O people of his time, the Son of Man will make his name for all eternity. The evil-minded, the treason plotters, they suppress their speech in fear of him. Aamu will fall to his sword. One will build the walls of the ruler to bar Aamu from entering Egypt. Then order will return to its seat while chaos is driven away. Rejoice, he who may behold, he who may attend the king. The Prophecy of Neferti. Sometime after the death of Kamose, Apep also died, though it does not seem that he died in battle. He was succeeded by Hammudi. Ahmose was the younger brother of Kamose and was likely too young to rule in his own right. His mother, Ahotep, served as his regent and quite possibly took part in military matters, which would explain her military equipment and ceremonial effects. At last, Ahmose led his soldiers to battle and finally laid siege to the Hyksos capital at Avaris. Details of the battle there are recorded in the autobiographical text of a soldier, also named Ahmose, which is found inscribed on the walls of his tomb in El Kab in southern Egypt. When the town of Avaris was besieged, I fought bravely on foot in His Majesty's presence. Thereupon I was appointed to the ship rising in Memphis. There was fighting on the water in Avaris. I made a seizure and carried off a hand. Then they fought again in this place. Then there was fighting in Egypt to the south of this town. Then Avaris was despoiled, and I brought spoil from there. Then Sharuhen was besieged for 3 years. His Majesty despoiled it, and I brought spoil from it. Then the gold of valor was given me, and my captives were given to me as slaves. The Autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana. Pictorial evidence for Ahmose's battles were found in his funerary monuments at Abydos, which show scenes of horse-driven chariots, archers, and Hyksos soldiers. This was the first time Egyptians used the chariot, which was a military innovation that had been brought to Egypt, possibly by the Hyksos themselves. The chariot would become part of one of the most iconic royal motifs carved on temple walls, showing the king as victorious against all enemies. Ahmose succeeded in conquering Avaris and expelled the Hyksos from Egypt. He then marched south to reclaim Lower Nubia. Now when His Majesty had slain the nomads of Asia, he sailed south to Kenten-Nefer to destroy the Nubian bowmen. His Majesty made a great slaughter among them, and I brought spoil from there, 2 living men and 3 hens. Then I was rewarded with gold once again, and 2 female slaves were given to me. His Majesty journeyed north, his heart rejoicing in valor and victory. He had conquered southerners, northerners. The Autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana. After defeating the Nubians and squashing minor revolts within Egypt, Ahmose reunited the country once more, thus ushering in a new dynasty that would build the largest empire in ancient Egyptian history. Ahmose constructed several monuments in Abydos, including a pyramid for both himself and his grandmother Tetisheri, as well as a tomb and temples. In Abydos, Ahmose was revered as a god, and celebration of his cult continued well into the New Kingdom period.
Egyptologists present the 17th dynasty almost as if these kings were the legitimate rulers, the ones who were truly supposed to follow the 13th dynasty, and all the other guys just got in the way. Possibly this is partly because the literature about these kings highlights them in this way, but this literature was written after the 17th dynasty. But also, it's an exciting story. It's an underdog story. We have this little guy between a rock and a hard place, and powerful, maybe even warrior queens, all who rise up against the non-Egyptian enemies. Ahmose kicks out the Nubians, he kicks out the Hyksos, reunites all of Egypt, takes over Nubia again. He's a hero. We like him. We admire him. We relate to him.
Sometime during Ahmose's reign, a cataclysmic event rocked the eastern Mediterranean. At a site on the small island of Thera, a volcano erupted and buried the town called Akrotiri in ash, which fortuitously preserved the vibrant frescoes that decorated houses. Unlike at Pompeii over 1400 years later, the inhabitants of the city evacuated before the volcano erupted. Nevertheless, its devastation was far-reaching. Ash from the volcano was found in Egypt and elsewhere. It has also been argued that the Tempest Stela of Ahmose details the effects of the volcanic eruption, though it probably is more so a reference to the Hyksos Wars. It is also suggested that the volcanic eruption led to the decline of the Minoan civilization. Minoans continued to occupy Avaris even after the Hyksos were expelled, but they disappear after the middle of the 18th dynasty.
By the time Ahmose was ruling peacefully in Egypt as the founder of the 18th dynasty, the Kerma kingdom of Nubia was gone. The old Babylonians, gone. The old Hittite kingdom, very drastically in decline. The Hyksos, gone. The Minoans were in decline until they completely disappeared from the archaeological record in Egypt in the middle of the 18th dynasty. We don't see another shift of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia on this scale until about the 1200s BCE, when the Sea Peoples invaded and mass migration from the north mixed things up a bit for about 25 years with similar results. The lesson to be learned here is that no empire, no kingdom, no nation, at any moment of human history, past, present, or future, is too great to escape its inevitable decline and collapse. Not a single one.
After 250 years of tumult, empires began to build again. Egypt would expand under the reign of Thutmose III. The Kassites controlled the Babylonian Empire. The Mitannians emerged as a superpower, and Shubbaluliuma I would restore and expand the Hittite Empire during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. The Assyrians would soon rise as well. Altogether, these empires would form the diplomatic network we now call the Club of Powers. But then, between 1200 and 1175 BCE, the so-called Sea Peoples would bring these great powers into another chaos corridor.
Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Lives on the Nile.